By the 80s, computer graphics were no longer just an experiment. They had become mainstream. This was the decade when computer graphics moved from research labs into Hollywood, revolutionizing film, television, and personal computing. It was a time of bold experimentation, groundbreaking technology, and visionary artists who laid the foundation for the stunning visuals we take for granted today. This is the story of the people who helped bring computer graphics into the future.
At Stanford, I went up to Xerox PARC, and Lynn Conway and Carver Mead were running a class on how to design integrated circuits. And I was a hardware designer and a software person, so I learned in that summer how to design integrated circuits, and then I decided I was going to build this thing called a geometry engine. I devised an architecture that would allow highly parallel computation, kind of the earliest forms of GPUs.
James Clark, the other half of the Catmull-Clark algorithm, is one of these rare people who managed to have a big impact in several different fields. In the 90s, along with Mark Andreessen, he turbocharged the internet revolution with the release of Netscape Navigator, one of the first easy-to-use web browsers. But before all that, in 1981, he founded Silicon Graphics, a company that will become synonymous with high-end computer graphics workstations. Unlike the bulky mainframes of the 60s and 70s, Silicon Graphics machines were compact and powerful. The first SGI computers had a very moderate CPU, the Motorola 68000, and later on the 68020 and 030, until they switched to RISC-based chips. What separated them from other computers of the time was the geometry engine, a series of chips dedicated to graphics, long before consumer-level GPUs existed.
12 of these 80,000 transistor VLSI geometry engines in a pipelined configuration provide the power to put high-level software in motion through direct hardware support and execution of displays. Gives you 22,000 depth-queued lines per second with true perspective. The system performs operations with full 32-bit floating point precision. Your workstation calculates and draws Bezier, B-spline, cardinal spline, and other cubic curves in real time.
Unlike earlier software-driven rendering, SGI's hardware acceleration allowed for real-time manipulation of 3D models. SGI workstations were widely adopted for designing pretty much everything, from cars to aircrafts and everything in between, influencing how industries approached product design. Researchers also leveraged SGI machines to create complex simulations in medicine, physics, and space exploration. By the late 80s, Silicon Graphics machines were increasingly used in film productions, gradually establishing SGI workstations as the backbone of visual effects in Hollywood. But it was the following decade where we saw SGI completely take over Hollywood. Aside from providing incredibly powerful hardware, one of SGI's most significant contributions was its role in the development of OpenGL, a widely used graphics API that became a standard for real-time rendering.
We believe that the productivity of companies racing to market, or racing to deadline, or maximizing the output of key individuals will require a truly interactive system. Not seconds, not fractions of seconds, but real-time. Motion.
Even though OpenGL is now replaced by other graphics APIs like Metal for the Mac and Vulkan for the PC, it's still being used to this day as it's easy to develop and it has a ton of documentation developers can easily reference.
Computer systems are going to be at the core of all future consumer products, practically speaking. And when I say computer systems, I mean the integration of a hardware and software system. So there's going to be very, very powerful chips with very powerful software, more or less embedded in consumer products.
Silicon Graphics dominated high-end 3D graphics, setting the stage for modern advancements in graphics processing. Though the company eventually declined due to the rise of cheaper consumer-grade GPUs, its legacy lives on in the technologies it pioneered.
I had the idea I wanted to to bring 3D graphics to the masses. So,
Right.
And by the way, most of NVIDIA people who have truly managed to achieve that are ex-Silicon Graphics people.
As Silicon Graphics was taking its baby steps in the early 80s, a lot of the VFX productions of that era were handled mainly by Cray and DEC PDP computers. Knowing how limited the hardware resources were back then, and the fact that no dedicated software existed, it's incredible to see how many production studios were dedicated to complete digital and 3D graphics pipelines. III, Magi, Digital Effects, and Robert Abel and Associates were all production houses that created amazing 3D visuals for the time. And in 1981, one movie would require the help of all four in order to complete its approximately 15 minutes worth of computer-generated shots. Tron was one of the first movies to incorporate so many computer-generated sequences, and considering that time in history, the task was massive. A lot of the time, they were developing the tools needed as they were working on the movie.
When we started dealing with the computer companies on Tron, you have to remember that a lot of the people who develop software for computers are not really filmmakers. They didn't begin their career as filmmakers. And so they won't approach the creation of visual imagery in the same way that a filmmaker will. We went in not knowing anything about computer technology. We only knew what we wanted to achieve on the film. But with discussions with the development groups in each company, we were convinced that we could actually develop the technology as we went along.
This is a terrifying way to work, but that's precisely how they did it.
You couldn't have all the tools you wanted because you didn't know what tools you would need. It became this process of learning about what the technology could do and then brainstorming the creative side to use it.
Interviews from that era make it clear that with the technology still in its infancy, there wasn't even a common language for discussing technical aspects. Listen to how legendary concept artist Sid Mead describes the modeling process of the light cycles. It took me a few seconds to realize he was describing Boolean operations.
The light cycle was a particular problem because it was being done by a facility who used the memory bank shape library kind of image production. In other words, you take set volumes and subtract or add to them.
Each studio would create specific sequences based on their individual strengths.
The way the work was divided up between the two companies was that Magi Synthevision did generally the more simple objects because their modeling system put basic geometries together. By adding and subtracting primary shapes, you create an object, and that's how they model. Even though they might look complex on film, they did the light cycles, the recognizers, the tanks. The other company that worked on the picture was Digital Effects, a company in New York City that Judson Rosebush had put together. They did the Tron logo at the beginning where you see the pieces coming together to form the character. And they also did the bit. For things that had multi-curves and more complex designs, Information International was far superior on that level because they were making polygonal models.
Digital Productions was the only newcomer, founded in 1982. Magi, Robert Abel and Associates, and III already had several years of experience. But as expected, their work flourished in the 80s. All of them managed to leave their mark on productions that are still talked about today. III started out in the 60s and specialized in scanning and transferring digital images to film through custom-made CRTs. It was in the early 70s when computer animators Gary Demos and John Whitney Jr. convinced the company to create a computer animation division. John Whitney Jr. followed in the steps of his father, John Whitney Sr. We covered John Whitney Sr. in the first episode of this series as a key figure in the world of computer animation. In 1981, before Tron went into full production, III worked on an equally groundbreaking piece of animation called Adam Powers' The Juggler. It was one of the earliest fully computer-generated character animations demonstrating realistic motion and shading. The short used motion capture for the juggler's animation, an incredible feat considering the technological limitations of the time. Unfortunately, in '82, after Demos and Whitney Jr. left the company to form Digital Productions, III decided to shut down its computer graphics division.
Computer Visual presents a new way to create pictures, Synthavision.
Magi developed its proprietary system, Synthavision, in the early 70s, and before Tron, created a variety of 3D animations for commercial and entertainment purposes. Synthavision worked by constructing objects from solid primitives, making it well suited for rendering smooth, industrial-looking shapes. It's the reason Magi was tasked with creating the light cycle and tank sequences in Tron.
I was working at the Disney Studios. I was an animator on Mickey's Christmas Carol when Tron was being produced. Two of my friends, Jerry Reese and Bill Croyer, were working on Tron. They were doing the storyboarding and the choreography, you might say, of all the computer animation. They were over in one of the trailers, and they had a computer that was hooked via phone line back to New York with Magi Synthavision. And my good friend Chris Wedge was back there working on the animation, and he would send over the phone line the scenes frame by frame by frame for them to look at, some of the early renderings. For me, this was some of the very first computer animation I had ever seen, and it was so exciting. The first scene that I remember them working on was the light cycle sequence, and it absolutely blew me away.
Shortly after Tron, around '83, John Lasseter got the chance to work with Magi on an animatic test based on the children's book Where the Wild Things Are. The test aimed to explore the viability of using computer graphics in animation by combining hand-drawn characters with computer-generated 3D backgrounds. It was a novel concept at the time, but as expected for Disney in that era, the studio failed to recognize the future impact of computer animation. One executive criticized the approach, arguing that since it wasn't cheaper than traditional animation, it wasn't worth pursuing. Shortly after this test, Lasseter was fired from Disney. However, he soon joined Lucasfilm's newly formed computer graphics group, which would later on become Pixar.
The picture, the photographed image, the synthetically created image, the recorded image, the manipulated image, is the language of the 21st century. It's the new language that you're going to speak, that I'm going to speak. We are the literates of the 20th and the 21st century.
Robert Abel and Associates was founded by Robert Abel in the early 70s. The company's long experience in computer graphics can be seen in the beautiful environments created for Tron. The company became renowned for its groundbreaking work in television commercials. Their ability to blend traditional animation, live action, and digital effects was quite remarkable. The Build-A-Phone commercial, created for General Electric, is a great example of that. The same applies for the MaxFly commercial for Dunlop, where Bill Kovacs and his colleagues seamlessly blended CGI with real footage.
We chose to do the golf ball using a real model and the whole surrounding environment with computer graphics, with some special type and final effects mixed in. So here you'll see the spot, hand animation for a lot of this, computer graphics all the way around. And then here is the real life golf ball, which is about the size of a bowling ball in reality. And then of course the computer graphics is not only matching to it, but matching while it's moving, which is much more difficult. And then at the end here we have some streaking, which is done on a graphics camera. And then these amorphous clouds are, as a matter of fact, also done with the computer.
One of its most iconic projects was the Brilliance commercial, which was created for the canned foods industry.
The answer will be in a package that saves energy, nutrients, and trouble. A package that can last the 3-year journey to Jupiter and back.
It's incredible to see the level of fidelity they managed to achieve for that time. As with Triple I's Juggler short, the commercial utilized motion capture to create the incredibly smooth motion of the robot. Robert Abel and Associates worked on an impressive amount of commercials. From Whirlpool and Atari to Pepsi and 7-Up, they always pushed the limits of what could be done. Despite its remarkable body of work, financial struggles led to the company's closure in '87. As we've seen time and time again, not much has changed since then. The cycle of success followed by sudden closure remains a constant. The mill, MPC, rhythm and hues are just recent examples of a pattern that has existed since the early days of VFX. In such a highly competitive industry, poor business decisions inevitably lead to the same disastrous outcome.
We have an audience that is always hungry for something new, fresh, and original looking, and I think computer graphics is going to provide, for many years to come, the best in entertainment.
Digital Productions was founded in 1982, and it quickly gained a reputation for pushing the boundaries of what was possible with computer graphics, thanks in large part to its use of Cray supercomputers. These powerful machines, primarily used for scientific research and military applications, allow Digital Productions to generate complex, high-resolution 3D imagery capable of withstanding scrutiny on the big screen. One of their most famous achievements was their work on the 1984 film The Last Starfighter, one of the first movies to feature extensive CGI instead of traditional model-based special effects. Digital Productions was responsible for creating all of these space battle sequences and helped establish CGI as a viable tool for filmmakers.
What I did was say, well, now our deadline is, I think at that point it was 6 months away. It had to be in theaters in 6 months, and I said, so how many frames are we doing? And they told me whatever the number was. And I said, how many polygons in each frame? And they told me whatever it was. And I said, and how long does it take to render a frame at that level? And they told me, and I stood up on the chalkboard and did the math. I said, according to your own figures, it's going to take you 17 months to complete this film. So we agreed we would simplify the shots, which is a real shame.
To create these sequences of frames, there was not enough power left to let us see it until we laboriously put it on film. That was a huge blind spot, and only then could you say, oh, I got that number wrong, or it was in the wrong position, and then you go back, change the number, and you have to go through the whole process again. We went from that to where we had instant playback, at least in a vector form, a kind of wireframe form. We could keyframe or position things and have the computer animate for us, and then we could alter the animation. And we ultimately had tremendous little handles on all the rotations and translation coordinates of any object, as well as the object itself. So at the end, we were able to just, as I say, almost use it like a word processor. We could just make scenes and see them instantly and correct them, see them instantly, correct them again, see them instantly, correct them again, see them instantly, one more correction, see them instantly, and got it. But you have to have that loop.
Beyond feature films, Digital Productions also ventured into the world of music videos. Mick Jagger's 1985 video for the song Hard Woman is an example of the company's knack for combining live footage with CGI. Another notable project was their work on the opening sequence of Jim Henson's Labyrinth. The owl was one of the first fully computer-generated creatures to appear in a Hollywood film, and I still remember being completely awestruck when I first saw this sequence as a kid. Despite these impressive accomplishments, Digital Productions had a short lifespan. The company was acquired in '86 by Omnibus, a Canadian company that also purchased Robert Abel and Associates. However, Omnibus defaulted on its loan in '87, leading to the collapse of both companies. Although digital productions lasted only about 4 years, the company still managed to leave its mark on the film industry and the world of computer graphics.
When we started the first electronic graphics department with one paint box, it was a small room on the 7th floor of our main building, Rockefeller Plaza. And now we have the entire floor of a quite large building, which consists of nothing but graphics equipment and the people who operate it.
Every once in a while, a company comes along and completely disrupts an industry. Quantel was one such company. Founded in 1973 in the UK, Quantel became one of the most influential companies of the 80s, with the release of the groundbreaking Paintbox and Paintbox Graphic. As one of the first dedicated digital painting systems, the Paintbox allowed artists to create, manipulate, and edit images and videos, paving the way for modern tools like Photoshop, After Effects, and even non-linear video editors. Everything from broadcast graphics to commercials and music videos used Quantel's system to create visuals never seen before. Paintbox and the systems that came after it matched the needs of pretty much everyone in the creative industry: graphic designers, photo editors, and of course, the early motion graphic artists of the time. The 80s were the heyday of MTV music videos, and if you wanted a flashy, impactful music video, you had to use a Paintbox. This led to the distinctive visual style that we now associate with the 80s. Dire Straits' iconic Money for Nothing music video used the Paintbox extensively for all the rotoscoping seen throughout the footage. The Cars You Might Think video also relied heavily on Paintbox. At the time, it was one of the most expensive music videos ever produced, with a budget nearly 3 times higher than the average. The video is filled with a wacky pop art aesthetic combining various graphic elements: real footage, images, and computer-generated graphics. The result is a vibrant collage that perfectly matches the song's upbeat energy. However, Paintbox wasn't just used for bold, flashy effects. It was also employed in more subtle ways, and Aha's Hunting High and Low music video is the perfect example of that. Director Steve Barron used Paintbox in several key areas. For one, for the morphing sequences where Martin Harkett transforms into an eagle.
Steve explained how that particular miracle was achieved.
Actually hand-drawn, frame by frame, like in the Disney method, but we're using an electronic computer paintbox machine, computer controlled, and we're able to line up both images of the image of Morton and the image of the eagle taking off, and to build progressively the stages of how his wings grow out of his arms, out of his jacket, and how the legs disappear from him, so that it all becomes one smooth transition.
It was also used for its compositing capabilities, seamlessly placing the singer into footage of an icy environment.
What are you doing?
We're putting the shot of Morton shot in the studio, which is a black silhouette on a white background, putting it onto a snowscape. It is a piece of library footage. What we need to do to make it look convincing is put a shadow on Morton, because there would naturally be a shadow if he was really there. He'd have a shadow that would come towards camera, and it would lay flat on the ground and stretch in perspective and move towards us.
Paintbox was also used to overlay the eagle's shadow onto multiple backgrounds, such as the mountains and cities seen in the video, further blending real footage with digital effects. Later on, with some necessary upgrades, the Paintbox became a powerful tool for manipulating images for print, long before Photoshop ever came into play. A great example of this is the album cover for Queen's album, The Miracle. The cover features a composite image of the 4 band members seamlessly blended into a single face. The effect essentially uses masks to blend between images, a very common workflow nowadays, but back then it required this dedicated hardware to achieve it. Paintbox introduced many features that became standard in computer graphics, such as layer-based editing, masking, digital paintbrushes, and many more. It even had color mixing, a very unique and natural approach for a digital system. And all that in 1981. At its peak, Quantel systems were the industry standard for high-end graphics, known for its speed, precision, and broadcast quality output. While it eventually became obsolete as software-based solutions took over, its legacy remains as a pioneering tool that shaped the modern digital graphics industry.
I don't deal with rules well or standard ways of doing things. And I've never been great at dealing with authority of people telling me that you can't do that because of something or you can't do this because of something.
John Warnock's work revolutionized multiple industries, including desktop publishing, printing, and digital graphics, leaving a lasting impact on the creative world. By the late 70s, Warnock worked at Xerox PARC, one of the most influential research labs in computing history. It was there that he co-developed Interpress, a page description language designed to improve digital printing. However, Xerox was slow to commercialize the technology, frustrating Warnock and leading him to seek other avenues for innovation.
They were computer scientists, and they were imagining what computer scientists wanted to do. They weren't imagining what the world was trying to do from a creative point of view, and they were simply not making tools to address that community.
In '82, Warnock and Chuck Geschke left Xerox and decided to start their own company, Adobe Systems. Their first product was PostScript, a page description language and essentially a continuation of their work at Xerox. PostScript enabled high-resolution printing at a time when high-quality prints were reserved for large, bulky industrial printers. In 1983, after visiting Adobe, Steve Jobs decided to license the technology to use it in Apple's new printer line, the Laser Writer. In '85, Apple finally released the first printer using PostScript, giving both consumers and professionals access to high-resolution printing. This initial breakthrough single-handedly sparked the desktop publishing boom of the 80s and 90s, and it's the reason Apple was so intertwined with that industry. PostScript aside, Warnock's most impactful contribution to the world of computer graphics was Illustrator, the vector-based drawing program that became one of the most essential tools for designers. He originally developed it to help his wife Marva, who was a graphic designer.
One time I was at a conference listening to John speak, though, and he said the reason he invented Illustrator was because his wife couldn't ink. I know he meant it very kindly, but...
Illustrator allowed artists to create smooth, scalable graphics, and it remains a staple in graphic design to this day.
Everybody said you're going to ruin good design because now anybody can do it. But the cream rises to the top. The creativity is in the designer. The creativity is in the person who uses the tools.
Warnock's work in the 80s laid the groundwork for Adobe's dominance in the creative field. Without his contributions, graphic design, publishing, and multimedia would likely look very different today. His strategic vision was also crucial for the integration of another important graphic software into Adobe's portfolio, Photoshop. Which brings us to...
Over the years since we shipped Photoshop 1, I've talked to innumerable people who have said, thank you for Photoshop, it's changed my career. Or I have a career now because of Photoshop. And that's one of the more heartwarming things to hear is people whose lives have really been transformed in a positive way by this goofy thing we did.
In '87, Tom Knoll, while studying at the University of Michigan, began developing a program to display grayscale images on his Mac. His brother John, who was working at Industrial Light and Magic, saw the potential and encouraged Tom to expand it into a complete image editor. Together, they refined the program and eventually licensed it to Adobe in '88. That part of the deal turned out to be very lucrative, as Adobe paid royalties for every copy sold, at least until the mid-90s when they finally bought the rights. John Knoll's deep involvement in visual effects helped drive Photoshop's early adoption in Hollywood, and it's the reason Photoshop had so many good tools for color adjustments from the very beginning. Getting clean mattes and getting rid of blue spill was one of Photoshop's early use cases at ILM. As a matter of fact, ILM was one of the first VFX studios to use Photoshop, not only for compositing, but also matte painting and concept art. Since its release, Photoshop has become the gold standard for digital imaging, revolutionizing industries like graphic design, photography, and VFX. Before Photoshop and Quantel systems, photo manipulation was done manually through darkroom techniques like dodging, burning, and airbrushing. Photoshop digitized and expanded these processes, making them faster, precise, and non-destructive. Tom Knoll continued working on Photoshop, developing key features such as layers, adjustment layers, 16-bit image processing, and camera raw processing. John Knoll continues his work at ILM as Chief Creative Officer and has worked on some of the most iconic films in cinema history.
I knew digital technology was going to be ultimately the most important thing in movies. The old way of doing things was going to be gone.
Founded by George Lucas in 1975, ILM had already proved themselves with the VFX of Star Wars, but the 80s saw them refine and expand their techniques to an unprecedented level. During the 80s, ILM found itself at a crossroads as computer graphics technology began to emerge as a viable tool for visual effects. While pioneers like Dennis Muren and John Knoll saw the potential of computer graphics, there was significant skepticism within the studio. Many artists and technicians who had mastered traditional methods like miniatures, matte paintings, and stop motion were hesitant to embrace computers, fearing that CG lacked the realism and craftsmanship of practical effects. However, early projects proved that CG could do things that would otherwise be impossible with traditional techniques. The first of those moments came in '85 with the movie Young Sherlock Holmes. The film featured a scene in which a stained glass knight comes to life and attacks a terrified priest. To emphasize the impossibility of the effect and make it clear that it couldn't be achieved through traditional methods, the team ensured that the knight's design reflected this.
What we needed and what we didn't have in that was, in the original, was a design that looked like you were getting your money's worth for CG. You know, what can we do that's different? So my brilliant wife came up with this, which is, this is her original thing, which was, because the character comes out of a piece of stained glass, that it's like flat, right? And it's made up of these different pieces. And we thought, boy, that's a great idea. She came up with, actually, in the jacuzzi. Great idea. It kind of looks, though, like a doll. You know, is that going to be a good enough, a mystery enough to see it, to spend all the computer graphic time doing something that looks like it might be a stop-mo piece of, copper painted over something? And she came up with the idea of having all the pieces being separate. That was the thing that it needed. Never seen it before. Hopefully it'll be powerful enough and strong enough when the audience sees it that they'll be wowed. Then when we got into designing it, I made sure that the pieces of glass, instead of being whatever they are, a quarter of an inch or 3/8, they were an inch thick. And I made sure each one of them to add that the pieces be bowed out, so they were convex in the direction, just slightly convex in the direction that the character was walking toward the priest.
The other breakthrough moment came a few years later with The Abyss. The CG sequences were yet another example of an impossible effect. The tentacle not only had to move smoothly around the environment, but it also had to reflect it. And to make things even more difficult, the water would not only interact with the characters, but also morph between them. By the late 80s, Dennis Muren, aware of the advantages of digital compositing, created the Mac Squad, with the aim of gradually transitioning traditional departments such as optical and rotoscope to the digital world. This transition was further advanced a few years later by John Knoll and his Rebel Mac unit, which sought to prove that off-the-shelf Macintosh computers could be used for high-end visual effects. These early milestones served as a proving ground for what was to come, showing that computer graphics were not just a novelty, but the next frontier in visual effects. Deciding who to cover in this video series is a challenge, since many individuals and companies have contributed to the evolution of computer graphics in one way or another. Lauren Carpenter, for example, is one such person. His fractal-based rendering techniques were at the center of the Genesis effect in Wrath of Khan. Later on, they became foundational in Pixar's RenderMan software. There's also Pacific Data Images, a VFX studio that managed to go from building commercials in the 80s to working on big-budget Hollywood productions in the 2000s. In the process, it managed to outlive all the other studios of that era. The 80s were a transformative decade for computer graphics. As a kid witnessing these developments, it felt like pure magic. Each movie, application, and commercial that pushed the boundaries of graphics was a mind-blowing experience. At least, it was for me. In the next episode, we'll explore how the breakthroughs of the 90s propelled CGI to even greater heights, bringing us closer to what we use and experience today.